All right, and here is the final half of chapter 11. So we're back on page 63, and we just finished reading that little section together. And so here in this part, guys, he's just talking about how people always ask him what it's like. What does it feel like to be free all of a sudden? And upon his arrival, I said I felt like one who had escaped a den of hungry lions. Okay, but then after a while, he started to feel really lonely and really insecure because here he is in this place that's totally unfamiliar. He doesn't really know anybody, and it's kind of scary, right? I've talked to you guys about the fugitive slave laws and the fact that there were some pretty stiff penalties, and there were also a lot of people walking around looking for slaves that they could then capture and send back to their masters to get some money for them, okay? And sometimes even free blacks were captured and sold into slavery, like what we saw with Solomon Northrop. So in this part here, it's just talking about the fact that here he is, he's in New York, he's kind of wandering around, and he is afraid to talk to anybody. He's afraid to speak to anyone for fear that he's going to talk to the wrong person and he's going to wind up getting kidnapped. That's a big fear, right? Because he's made it out, but, he's like, uh-oh. So trust no man basically becomes his motto, and it's one that he's held as a slave. Okay? So then he's doing some thinking more about, what it's like to walk around and all of that, how he's helpless in this situation. But then he starts talking about someone who saved him. So he was relieved from all of this distress, right? This distressing situation, by the humane hand of Mr. David Ruggles, okay, whose vigilance, kindness, and perseverance I shall never forget. Okay, so David Ruggles, because he's mentioning him by name, I am assuming, I will guess, he is an abolitionist who kind of shepherds Frederick Douglass to safety. So he helps him out. And it seems as though by what Frederick Douglass says, he's really grateful to him for it. So then up here on 65, some things you should know about is after he went into Mr. Ruggles, after he met up with him, Mr. Ruggles wanted to know, well, where do you want to go, Frederick? Because New York was not a safe place. He deemed it unsafe for him to remain in New York. So Frederick Douglass thinks about the skills that he has, right? And he's a caulker on ships. So he says he wants to go where he can get some work. So he was thinking about Canada, but instead he winds up settling on the idea of going to New Bedford. Okay? Now here's something that's really nice too. Frederick Douglass, apparently while he was at Baltimore, he met a woman named Anna who was free. And Anna came immediately to meet Frederick Douglass upon hearing that he had made it. Okay? So, a few days after that, they are married. Okay? So there is a marriage ceremony. So Frederick Douglass and Anna are married. And then this is the exact copy, I guess, of their marriage certificate, right, of what it says. And so, basically, upon getting this marriage certificate, and Mr. Ruggles gave them $5, okay? So gave them $5 to get them started. They basically took up their bags, he and Anna, and they set out on a steamboat for Newport, okay? So, on their way, they did have some challenges and things like that because they didn't have a ton of money. So they lacked the necessary money to pay for the full fare, but they stayed on anyway with the hopes that they'd figure something out. And it did work out because by the time they got to New Bedford, they came to meet up with Nathan Johnson. Okay, so Nathan Johnson is another important person. And Nathan Johnson kind of takes care of them and helps them to pay their fare. Okay, so Mr. Johnson advanced the money, which is pretty cool. That's a nice guy, right? So here, we're going to read this little section together on 66. We now began to feel a degree of safety and to prepare ourselves for the duties and responsibilities of a life of freedom. On the morning after our arrival at New Bedford, while at the breakfast table, the question arose as to what name I should be called by. The name given me by my mother was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. I, however, had dispensed with the 2 middle names long before I left Maryland, so that I was generally known by the name of Frederick Bailey. I started from Baltimore bearing the name of Stanley. When I got to New York, I again changed my name to Frederick Johnson, and thought that that would be the last change. But when I got to New Bedford, I found it necessary again to change my name. The reason of this necessity was that there were so many Johnsons in New Bedford, it was already quite difficult to distinguish between them. I gave Mr. Johnson the privilege of choosing me a name, but told him he must not take from me the name of Frederick. I must hold on to that to preserve a sense of my identity. Mr. Johnson had just been reading The Lady of the Lake, and at once suggested that my name be Douglas. From that time until now, I have been called Frederick Douglass, and I am more widely known by that name than by either of the others. I shall continue to use it as my own. Okay, so what he's talking about here is he had to change his name so that at first he might elude capture, right? So that no one would know exactly who he was. So he gave a different name. So he had to change his name to try to stay safe. And finally, he winds up settling on Douglas. So he goes from the last name of Bailey, which was his mother's last name, right? That was his last name from birth, to Douglas. But he says, let me please keep Frederick. It's really important for me to still be called Frederick so that I can have some sense of who I am, right? I can remember who I am. Okay, and then he starts talking about what things look like in New Bedford, because apparently he thought, oh, in the North, because they don't have slaves and that kind of stuff, they must be very, very poor up there. But that's not true at all. What he finds out is that what he had expected was that people would live in very simple ways, that they wouldn't know anything about luxury or grandeur or anything like that, right? But actually, that proves to be very different. He sees a lot of wealth around him, okay? So he goes, wow, the North actually is very prosperous too. So, and then he starts thinking, well, what the heck is wrong with the South then, right? So the North equals quite wealthy. Like things look good. And he goes, wow, that's good. I'm glad, right? He says everything looks clean and new and beautiful and all that stuff, right? He doesn't see all the poverty that he had seen when he was at the plantation in Hillsborough, Easton, St. Michael's, and Baltimore. So even in the city of Baltimore, he had seen a lot of poverty. So the people looked able, stronger, healthier, and happier, right? Yay, than those of Maryland. So it made him glad to see that people were really doing well without him feeling sad about seeing extreme poverty. He's like, wow, this is really nice. This is good. And then on 68, he is talking about the fact that the African-American community really bonded together to protect each other, right? So they tried to help each other stay safe from bloodthirsty kidnappers at any cost. And apparently there was one guy who betrayed somebody else, and at a prayer meeting, this person was about to be taken out and killed. So basically, the guy who was a narc, basically, is there in the congregation, and then someone says, hey, let's go get him. Okay, I would recommend you young men take him outside out the door and kill him. All right, so they mean business. And that guy ran away, right? The betrayer escaped and was never heard from again in the community. So people just didn't do that to each other, right? They held together to help each other. And so Frederick gets a job because he needs some money, right, now that he's free and he has a wife. So he gets a job, but not doing exactly what he would normally do, right? So it sounds like he's basically just gassing up ships. A sloop, right, is a type of boat. So he's gassing up boats and stuff like that, putting oil in them. And this time, though, he's like, wow, there is no Master Hugh waiting around for me to give him my money. Ha. So now finally it is his own. And then on our last page here, he's saying, you know what? He doesn't care about how hard the work was or how dirty it was. He would do anything. He would saw wood. He would shovel coal. He would carry the hod. I'm not sure what a hod is. I have no idea. Sweep the chimney or roll oil casks, all of which he did for nearly 3 years. So he was doing very unskilled labor. okay? He was doing unskilled labor, but he was happy to do it. But he was okay because he was a free man and because it was honest work and he's making money. All right, and now we have this last part of the book. In about 4 months after I went to New Bedford, there came a young man to me and inquired if I did not wish to take the Liberator. I told him I did, but just having made my escape from slavery, I remarked that I was unable to pay for it then. I, however, finally became a subscriber to it. So the Liberator is that paper that is written by William Lloyd Garrison. Remember that guy? Okay, so he's a major abolitionist. The paper came, and I read it from week to week with such feeling as it would be quite idle for me to attempt to describe. The paper became my meat and my drink. My soul was set all on fire. Its sympathy for my brethren in bonds, its scathing denunciations of slaveholders, its faithful exposures of slavery, and its powerful attacks upon the upholders of the institution sent a thrill of joy through my soul, such as I had never felt before. So he loves reading this paper. He loves this paper. It makes him feel such passion for the cause, right? This newspaper. So it just brings up some powerful feeling for him, right? He calls it his meat and his drink. I had not long been a reader of The Liberator before I got a pretty correct idea of the principles, measures, and spirit of the anti-slavery reform. I took right hold of the cause. I could do but little, but what I could I did with a joyful heart and never felt happier than when in an anti-slavery meeting. I seldom had much to say at the meetings, because what I wanted to say was said so much better by others. He's being humble there, right? Because he was actually a really eloquent speaker. But while attending an anti-slavery convention at Nantucket on the 11th of August, 1841, I felt strongly moved to speak and was at the same time much urged to do so by Mr. William C. Coffin, a gentleman who had heard me speak in the C. People's meeting at New Bedford. It was a severe cross, and I took it up reluctantly. The truth was, I felt myself a slave, and the idea of speaking to white people weighed me down. I spoke but a few moments, when I felt a degree of freedom, and said what I desired with considerable ease. From that time until now, I have been engaged in pleading the cause of my brethren. With what success and with what devotion, I leave those acquainted with my labors to decide. So, this guy, William Coffin, in 1841, encourages Frederick to speak in front of a crowd. And at first, Frederick Douglass is going, no, I don't want to do that. I want to talk in front of these white people. I don't want to do that, because he still felt kind of like a slave when he was speaking in front of them. But once he starts speaking, he feels this sense of freedom, right? And then it becomes a lot easier for him. And then from then on, the rest is history, right? So William Coffin encourages Frederick Douglass to speak in front of the audience, and the rest is history. He was an amazing public speaker, and he did so much for the abolitionist cause. All right, guys.